Welcome to Psych Psychology University. I'm Alexa Elliott. Thank you so much for being here. On today's episode, we're speaking with Tom Gilovich. Tom Gilovich is Irene Blecher-Rosenfeld Professor of Psychology at Cornell University and a Fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. He earned his BA from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his PhD from Stanford. In his research, he's focused on the areas of human judgment, decision-making, biases, and behavioral economics. Tom's books include the famous textbook Social Psychology, as well as the popular books How We Know What Isn't So, The Fallibility of Human Reason in Everyday Life, and co-authored with Lee Ross, The Wisest One in the Room, How You Can Benefit from Social Psychology's Most Powerful Insights. It was a great pleasure to speak with someone of Tom's caliber for this first episode of the show. So, many thanks to him. And now here is Tom Gilovich. I guess I wanted to start with what's the psychological reason for regret or the purpose of regret, and do we learn from our regrets or do we tend to repeat the same mistakes in life?
Regret theorists have talked about more broadly counterfactual thinking, imagining and getting stuck on thinking about events that didn't happen serve a useful function. They allow us to, if we think about, okay, this thing happened, but if I made a different decision, something better could have happened. That's laying the groundwork for doing better next time. And that certainly does work a lot of the time, that people have searing kind of regrets that they never want to repeat. And some people live up to that and, in fact, do better. So I think the theorists who make that claim are on pretty solid ground. On the other hand, people are people and flawed, and sometimes, of course, people make the same mistakes repeatedly because even if you vow to do better the next time comes up with all sorts of temptations, and you get going down a certain path that is going to lead to regret yet again. So the answer to your question is both happens. Yes, we do learn from it, and yes, people often, unfortunately, get stuck making the same kinds of mistakes multiple times.
But the purpose would be to, like you said, lay a sort of cognitive framework so that we don't repeat the same error that's going to cause us the same pain again in the future. Ideally, that would be the purpose that regret could serve.
Yeah, I mean, another way of saying that is a lot of theorists of decision-making talk about anticipated regret and trying to avoid anticipated regret. And we often can lay out things cognitively. So we say, if I pursue a particular course of action, there is some downside risk and I might regret that. And if that regret looms large enough, you won't choose it. You'll choose something else. Well, it's much more likely that it's going to loom larger in your mind, and you can imagine it being much more painful if, in fact, you have experienced it.
Right.
So when you experience the genuine regret, that pain is such that when you face the next decision node and you're doing this, minimize possible regret, that's going to receive a lot of extra weight.
What's going on in the brain when we experience regret? Is it sort of on the same spectrum as other acutely painful emotions like grief and loss?
Well, the closest cousins that investigators have talked about and done some work on are things like shame and guilt. You could argue those are particular, more specific emotions that are associated with regret. Regret is a very cognitively oriented emotion that involves comparing what did happen with some alternative state of affairs. And sometimes it's just, this fell short. If I had made a different decision, I'd be better off. Not a lot of emotion there, some disappointment, some sadness, and other times, of course, it could be much more intense that, I did this and should have done that instead. I feel guilty, I feel shame, etc.
And these emotions, guilt and shame, they can be, it's funny because we can feel regret, just private regret that wasn't consequential for anyone else other than ourselves, didn't affect anyone other than ourselves. So can regret also serve to be an indicator to us of our own personalities? For example, if a person cheats on a test, never gets caught, but always regrets that they cheated on the test, that can happen where we just have private regrets. And is that because it's representing a disconnect about who we thought we were or the kind of person we want to be?
Yeah, again, it fits the general template of regret, of comparing what is with something else, and the something else in the circumstance you describe is either the ideal person you'd like to be, oh, I've fallen short of that, or the what you might call the ought, what Tori Higgins calls the ought self, the self I should be. You should be the kind of person who doesn't need to cheat on an exam. What are you doing? You've fallen short of your moral self. Even if someone else doesn't know it, you've fallen short in your own eyes, and that produces regret, even if it doesn't, in that case, doesn't produce shame, because no one else knows, but it easily could produce guilt.
Is that ought self an actual, an attainable emotional state, psychological state, or is that just sort of a concept that we have mentally to keep us going, to keep us moving forward?
Well, there's a lot to be said on that subject. I mean, it's akin to the age-old Freudian notion of the superego, the things you should be doing, and that is drilled into our heads by the parents we have, the culture in which we grow up, our own sense of our own identity. There are different versions of the ought, but they're very powerful, and so falling short produces quite a bit of regret. One of the more interesting things that I discovered in studying regret was just how willing people were to talk about them. You know, it was when I first started interviewing people, since you famously Edith Piaf has a song, I Regret Nothing, it's entirely possible people would say, no, I don't have any regrets, no, not me, I did it my way, etc. No, that wasn't the case. Everybody we talked to had some regrets, and boy, were they willing to talk about them. Maybe there are some more painful, shameful regrets that they weren't willing to share with me, but they shared a lot of stuff that the emotions on their face indicated, no, they took very seriously. These were deep regrets that did produce shame, and one wonders how much the interview was actually helpful, almost like an expiation experience.
Right. I think there's a deep desire to exercise or purge those feelings and be done with them once and for all. And as enticing it is to sort of want to regurgitate that bumper sticker or tattoo some people get, no regrets. I think the truth is that most of us have them, and any chance we get to maybe chip away at them a little bit and shed a little bit of it, including just talking with someone else, I think we would take. When we're in a state of acutely experiencing regret, what is the mature or enlightened way to deal with those acute emotions at the time we're experiencing them?
I don't know if there's a general answer to that question, because regrets come in all sorts of different flavors. And, getting back to your opening question about the functionality of it, certain kinds of regrets can be acted upon. If you feel like you've hurt someone else, you've let someone else down, we often say to ourselves, oh, I really screwed up, there's nothing I can do about it now, when in fact there is something you can do about it now. And going back and making amends is more possible than people imagine. First of all, other people are much more accepting of apologies than people anticipate. I think, as a general rule, people are so concerned with awkwardness and embarrassment. It's going to be freighted to talk to another person about something you did to hurt or disappoint them. And that's true. But those tend to be overblown. When we make those repair efforts, they tend to go pretty well. I mean, you need to look no farther than basically every situation comedy episode that's ever existed. Because situation comedies wouldn't exist if people weren't overly afraid of potential tension.
Right.
So Curb Your Enthusiasm. It would be awkward if I told you what I'm really thinking, so I tell you something else, and then the whole plot revolves around the fact that I'm not being genuine.
And it's still really awkward.
And ends up being even worse than it would have been. If we just talked to each other and named what's awkward in front of us, I suspect we'd do a lot better. And that goes for certain kinds of regrets where people can literally atone. People can literally do repair work to make it better.
If it's something that you can't go back and apologize, this will be the last question on regret, and then we'll move on. But if it is something that you can't atone for with another person, if it just involves yourself, something you didn't do that you wish you had done, what could lighten that burden? Maybe a type of self-compassion or forgiving yourself in place of like the way another person would forgive you if you were apologizing to another person?
Yeah, there are a lot of moves that you can make. A lot of cognitive therapies are based on that idea that people are being too hard on themselves, right, and really articulating why is it that you're making these statements, you're blaming yourself so heavily, and certain therapeutic interventions are all about trying to get people to see that they're being too harsh on themselves. As you alluded to earlier, and is represented in one of the rituals, for example, in the Catholic Church, just talking about things is helpful to people. Going to confession. Nothing really happens there. You're just speaking it to the priest, but it turns out to be apparently a very healthy ritual. And
I have heard you talk about how, in general, people overwhelmingly regret more things that they did not do as opposed to things that they did.
Or another way of saying that is that the regrets of inaction tend to stick with people longer. In the short term, people regret making mistakes of action, but they often do things to deal with them, either actually or psychologically, and what gets left over are these gnawing aches of the things that they didn't do, the person they didn't become.
For this interview, I did read How We Know What Isn't So, and the chapter that stood out for me the most was chapter 9, Belief in the Effectiveness of Questionable Interpersonal Strategies. You talk about the phenomenon of self-handicapping. I'm just wondering if you can give us a quick definition of what self-handicapping is.
Sure. There's sort of two varieties of self-handicapping. One is you put actual roadblocks in the way of your performance so that you have an excuse if you don't do well. So the classic example is an actor who's quite nervous might get rip-roaring drunk before performing. If they're able to overcome their inebriation, wow, you must be a brilliant actor. You can perform even when inebriated. If you fail, it's not because you don't have talent, it's because of the drinking. That's putting an actual barrier in your path. Or not studying for an exam. If I succeed, great, I must be brilliant. If I didn't succeed, I didn't study. I didn't take it seriously enough. It's not that I don't have the ability. Those are actual self-handicaps. Those exist. Those are common. Probably even more common are what you might call feigned self-handicap, where people privately study like mad.
Right.
Claim that they don't, so that if they don't succeed, no one thinks that they aren't smart. They're attributing it to their not studying so hard. I think in that chapter I mentioned this term. I don't know why. It's always kind of cracked me up. That it existed at Dartmouth. A friend told me about it who was a Dartmouth student in the 60s, called sneaky bookers.
Right, I read that.
Sneak off and study somewhere. For some reason I always liked that term.
Yeah. I need to tell you something. In my copy of the book, there's a typo, and the second time the term is mentioned, it's sneaky hookers.
Oh, no. You gotta be kidding. All the typos.
So that's your next book, though, right? That's not this one, not sneaky hookers. If we do that, when we do that over and over again, though, repeatedly, what does it indicate about the performance or the achievement that we're blocking ourselves from attaining? Does it indicate that we don't actually want to achieve that thing if we self-handicap, that we actually want to remain in the state minus that achievement? I'm just wondering what the relationship is between what we think we want and self-handicapping. I mean, obviously most people in school would rather perform well. An actor would rather go to the audition and book the job, or at least that's what we think. So what's the relationship there, and what can it tell us about what we think we want?
I don't think we have to assume that people have puzzling or pathological motives, that they think they want this, but they really don't. I'm sure there are some circumstances in which that's true. People are complicated, and you'll find examples of almost anything. But by and large, people do want to excel. People do want to land the job. People do want to nail the role, or score the winning goal, etc. But the fear of failing is very pronounced, and so you protect against the implications of failure. Your concern about what other people are going to think is so powerful that you do these paradoxical things. My colleague Jonathan Haidt, I think, captured an idea where he said, the real, what unites so much of the field of physics? Well, the one primary force is the force of gravity. What unites psychology, social psychology in particular? It's embarrassment, the fear of embarrassment and awkwardness. If we understand what people are doing, if we realize how attuned they are to, this could be embarrassing, so I'm not going to do this, or this could be embarrassing if I fail, so let me have a drink before I start. So at least I won't be blamed, the drinking won't be blamed.
Yeah. I guess evolutionarily we're not developed to specifically to nail roles or exceed academically, but why is fear so predominant when it gets in the way of so much accomplishment?
I think the answer is really the flip side of what I tell my students the first day of my social psych course, which is the reason you should care about what social psychology has to offer is that no matter what you do in life, no matter how much of an introvert you are, if you just want to be left alone and write a book or write code and so on, even then, the most important things in your life will be other people.
Right.
Someone has to want your program or want to read your book or something, and you've got to interact with people. It's said over and over in every psychology text, humans are a social species. And that's true. In our deep evolutionary past, you couldn't go it alone. Now maybe you can. But back then you couldn't. So you really had to be, we had to evolve to be hypersensitive to our reputations, what other people thought of us. And so we see that in a very pronounced fashion in every walk of life. People are incredibly sensitive to what other people might think of them. Again, goes back to the Jonathan Haidt point that embarrassment is the gravity of psychology.
Okay. Is there a relationship between self-handicapping and procrastination? I guess, is embarrassment at the heart of procrastination as well, even if it's just embarrassment to ourselves that the essay didn't turn out as well as we thought it would, so we just never write it? Is there a relationship there to simply procrastinating?
They're very different things.
They are, okay.
Two places of overlap. One is that people can deliberately procrastinate. It's like not studying. Put that barrier in my path so that if I fail, there's an excuse. That's one thing. They also overlap because in each case, it's a fear. There can be certain circumstances in which the procrastination is created by a fear of performing, a fear of failing if one does perform, and that leads you to put it off, put it off, put it off. However, there are many other brands or flavors of procrastination. that are really quite different from self-handicapping. A lot of the distractions in the world are
highly distracting.
Highly distracting, yes. And it takes an strong exercise of will to not pay attention to them and get back to what you need to do.
I also wanted to talk about, as you call them, questionable interpersonal strategies. How is it that we've all met people like this, or it's funny I say it like that, we've all met people like this. I guess nobody wants to think of themselves as the somebody who maybe others perceive radically differently than we perceive ourselves. But how come some people do it seems to never click for them how they're perceived by others, and as you write about, they just exist in social strategies that don't work, don't get them the outcomes they want, but they seem to never make that connection and just continue like that?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the social world is complicated. As I just said, it's incredibly important for people. That is, what their reputation is like. Their standing in the group is incredibly important. That makes social interaction, many of them, very fraught. At the same time, we don't give people the kind of feedback would be most helpful. Give a talk, let's say, and you run into someone afterwards and they say, "Hey, great talk." You just can't trust that. You have no idea, because if you really liked the talk, you say great talk. If you didn't like the talk, you say great talk. Now, you might say it with more, presumably you do say it with more enthusiasm in the former case than the latter, but now we're asking the person who gave the talk to carefully titrate the feedback they received and discern its meaning, and that's a difficult task. In some ways, you can flip the question around and wonder, why aren't there more people like that name drop too much and do a bunch of things that make us think less of them, which is the opposite of their goal, because we aren't giving them the feedback that they really need.
Actually, when you put it that way, it does make me realize just how finely tuned most people are in social interaction, and to what other people could, all the variables of what other people could possibly think and how other people could possibly interpret them. You're right, it's actually surprising that more people aren't a bit out of it socially, or when it comes to their own self-concept or how other people are perceiving them. I guess social interaction is just so complex that we're so finely tuned for it. Why is it that some people don't seem to be able to distinguish between, this is more now personally for themselves as individuals as opposed to in social interaction? I wanted to ask you about self-delusion and self-deception. Why is it that some people don't seem able to distinguish between wishful thinking and actual planning and acting on their plans towards a goal? Like, I'm thinking about just an example of somebody who maybe has a good salary, has a good job, and instead of saving their money slowly on some kind of low-risk investment that's not going to pay off for a long time but eventually will, they go to the casino every weekend, and each weekend they think, I'm really going to win this time. This is going to really be the big payoff. I'm wondering what the difference in those two types of thinking are, and also what does that kind of thinking give people that being realistic doesn't give people?
Yeah, I think the question of delusion, as you put it, or what's the other word that you said, wishful thinking, overconfidence more generally, is really rich and deep and important and puzzling. That is to say, there's a lot of evidence indicating that people are generally overconfident. If you ask people, where do you stand compared to your peers, people, the famous above average effect, people on average think they're much better than average on almost anything you can name. People think that good things are more likely to happen to them than the average person, and bad things are less likely to happen to them. You give people quizzes about questions and ask them to express their confidence in the likelihood that they answered correctly. Their confidence vastly exceeds their accuracy rate. when you have people forecast political and social outcomes, expert forecasters, they're way more confident than their track record suggests. All of this is powerful evidence that we are massively overconfident. People think they can drive better when intoxicated than they really can, and we have traffic fatalities as a result. People walk up and down stairs looking at their cell phones, and so we have people in emergency rooms all across the world because of that, etc. So, overconfidence, a big problem. On the other hand, it's kind of an engine for a lot of productive things. If people weren't overconfident, would we have enough people starting, let's say, new businesses to generate a vibrant economy? You know, something like only 4 out of every 10 new businesses is still surviving after 3 years. So 60% failure rate. If you ask everyone who's starting it up, they're going to say, no, my success rate is much higher. My chance of success is much higher than 40%. Well, no, it's not. We can statistically show that it's 40% on average for people. But if everyone thought that, would you start a new business? Probably not. What would our economy look like if that were the case? Might be pretty sobering. So there's this really interesting tension between the fact that we have overconfidence and for some individuals, people who get in automobile accidents, people who fall down stairs and break bones because they're looking at their cell phone or putting their sweater on over their head while walking downstairs, being overconfident that they can achieve this. So even though it might be individually counterproductive and problematic, collectively for society, at least in one domain, when it comes to the economy, it might do us a lot of good. And so this tension, which a lot of people have written about, of is being overconfident, is being overly optimistic a good thing? Is that a sign of mental health? If you're perfectly realistic, would life seem, well, what it really is? I don't want to say nasty, brutish, and short, but it's certainly short. Whether it's nasty or brutish or not, it varies in the circumstances, but yeah, it is very short, and if you're realistic about that, it makes life tough to enjoy.
Right. Wasn't there a finding at some point recently that people who are depressed actually make better predictions or seem to be more in tune, seem to be more realistic about the outcomes for themselves and others?
Yeah, there's some evidence to that effect. They are less overconfident. And there aren't as many studies on that subject looking at depressed populations, and there's something there, but it's much more modest than the message that's out there in the public. I think there's been a little bit of overclaiming on that. Again, I don't want to fault anyone for that. There is evidence to suggest that, but the effect's nowhere near as big as it's often portrayed.
So depressed people aren't getting it all right.
No.
What's the relationship between magical thinking or just plain believing something truly unlikely is going to happen to you? Is that just a continuation further along the spectrum of being overconfident, or is that a different phenomenon? You know, people who think they're going to win the lottery or something, when the end times come, you know, preppers, people that prepare for the end of the world. But people who are functional in everyday life, you know, think they're going to be able to save their family when the inevitable global economic meltdown happens. Is that a related phenomenon or a different cognitive process?
I mean, one thing that those are a lot of different things, but one thing they have in common is the act of imagination isn't a neutral act. Whatever you imagine seems, often ever so slightly, a little more likely. Lotteries invite you to do that. They, will say, you too can be a winner, and they might send you an appeal to sign up for a certain Publishers Clearinghouse used to do this, where they'd say, They send you a faux check with your name in it.
Oh, I remember those. I remember those. Yeah.
What would that be like to get $10 million? Well, once you've seen that check, it's not like suddenly you necessarily think you're going to win. But it's going to be more likely. You've imagined it, and anything we imagine seems more likely. And so if you have a friend, let's say, who encourages you to think and says, I think the whole world economy could collapse, and you better get some survivalist material. You better get a backpack filled with stuff that can allow you to survive for a couple of weeks on your own. Well, once you've imagined those things, they seem much more real. And so all of these things, whether you're talking about delusions in the positive realm or in the more negative realm, is what is it you allow your mind to go to entertain. The entertaining, again, has consequences. Whatever you imagine seems ever so slightly more likely.
That ties into something else I wanted to ask you. Something that helped me personally with procrastination was what I thought was a great realization at the time, which is that there's really only doing something and not doing something. If you have an essay to turn in for school, if you're not writing it, then it's not getting done. But can the act of imagining, thinking about something you need to do, actually, is it part of the process of getting you closer to doing something, or is it just black and white that you're either taking actions towards the accomplishment of a task or you're not?
There's a lot of material there. That is Catholic Church idea that thought is father to the deed. That's true. If you start to imagine, I've got an ice cream bar in my freezer. Do I want an ice cream? Now you've thought about it, and you're now more likely to go to the refrigerator and get it than if you hadn't. And it has been shown that if you rehearse how you're going to get from A to B, what the steps are, people talk about this as imagining your implementational intentions, not just your broad intention to do something, but how you might do it makes it more likely. So yeah, there is truth to that. At the same time, I like your idea that you're either doing something or not, which is, and that relates to a broad swath of psychology, that our attitudes often follow more powerfully, more strongly, more directly from our behavior than our attitudes generate our behavior. And in the procrastination realm, it plays out in that a lot of people, writers, let's say, feel like, I can't do it right now. I need to be inspired.
Exactly. Yes, you're always waiting for that ideal state to kick in, and then you'll undertake all the things you need to get done. But that ideal state, you never seem to be able to just will yourself into it. At some point, no matter how you feel, or whether you're having a good hair day or not, or whatever, you just have to get cracking and start on the task. And then often you start feeling more like doing that thing.
Yep. As some writers have said, real writers just write.
Right.
And even when it feels unpleasant to do so, and sometimes they'll write, and it will still be unpleasant to do so, and it'll be a chore, and other times you just can't predict. It started out, I didn't feel like it, and I got into a groove.
What's advice for how we can gauge how serious we are about a goal? I mean, how can we gauge whether we're planning something we'll truly undertake, that we're likely to undertake, or that we're just daydreaming? Is it just a matter of time? Like, if you haven't started doing something by this amount of time, you're probably not going to do it? Or is there something about our thinking, or how thinking about something makes us feel, that can indicate to us how serious we are about that goal?
It's an interesting question. I'm going to have to take a pass on it, though, because I don't really have any professional insight on it. I haven't done work on the subject and don't teach on the subject. If you ever have on your podcast Ayelet Fishbach at the University of Chicago, that's exactly the kind of stuff that she would have dealt with and probably would have something to say about.
Okay. What does wise self-reflection look like?
Wisdom is a very slippery term. People have offered many different definitions of it, or there are different types of wisdom. The one that we emphasize the most in the book is wisdom as perspective. The wise person has a better, and by that usually meant broader perspective on things that relates to the idea of, oh, are older people wiser than younger people? Well, certainly not always, but maybe on average, yes. That's because they've had more experience, and therefore when something comes up that seems completely unique, this is a one of a kind, it can seem to the young person. The older, wiser person can say, well, in certain ways it is one of a kind, but it's also a lot like, and they can liken it to some other circumstance and take what one has learned from those other circumstances to inform this current situation. And so we spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about the fact that we are often looking at the world through a very narrow lens, a peephole, if you will. And part of the job of being a wise person is to broaden that peephole, to figure out what sources of information beyond your own perspective you need to consult, when to go back and look at the past and see how it resembles the current circumstance, when to talk to other people, when in particular to talk to people of a different, let's say, political persuasion, etc.
When and how do you most get feedback from people, and what would you say that, what insights from that book would you say that people have found the most helpful, or have you gotten the most feedback about?
It's interesting. One of the earliest chapters, in fact the first real chapter beyond the introduction, is about the phenomenon of naive realism.
Mm-hmm.
And most people talk about that and how it's helped them to think about things. I find that interesting because there are certain subjects in psychology that when you lecture on them, you know this is going to go over well. It's interesting, it's easy to explain, people will be able to relate to it. I've got this. And there are other things that are just hard, certain statistical principles, okay, when I'm lecturing on this subject, I've got my work cut out for me. Naive realism falls somewhere in the middle. Some years it just sings. People get it, and it's one of the best lectures of the term. Other years it just doesn't work. And part of it, and so I was pleased to see that people took to that chapter so much. And part of the problem is it's an idea, the broader naive realism idea is that we think that we're looking at the world, when in fact we're looking at our construction or interpretation of the world, and it's the meaning we assign to stimuli that determines our behavior, not the stimuli themselves. And mostly, different people have the same interpretation of the stimuli out there. We all look at the moon, and it looks really giant on the horizon, and it doesn't look as big at the zenith. We all see it that way. But, of course, there are many things that we don't see the same way, and we think we're looking directly at the way things are rather than partly constructing them. Now, the reason that some years it really sings, it's a very powerful idea, but you really have to nail it. You have to get it exactly right, because if you move a little bit to the left, people go, well, that's obvious. This isn't interesting. If you move a little bit to the right, people go, that's not true. Because there is a version that just veers a little bit in one direction that isn't quite right, and people will reject it. And there's a version that's just to the left of the real idea that, yeah, it is a little boring. Of course, that's true. And so it's a very fine line you have to walk. And in fact, most textbooks, let's say, in social psychology don't even treat the idea of naive realism.
Is it mostly important just to be aware of the idea of naive realism and that you're viewing the world through your own narrow framework? Is that enlightening on its own, or are there specific things acting on our behavior and other people's behavior that we need to be aware of that can greatly broaden our perspective and help make us at least one of the wiser ones in the room?
I think that idea in and of itself is important to know.
Okay.
Because if you contextualize it more, and let's say you're going to give people the advice, well, when it comes to political ideas, maybe you aren't as informed as you think, and you ought to take the other side seriously, then, maybe some people will do that, but many people may resist it. When you understand, no, everything is tied to this. When someone says, oh, it's cold in here, and you're not cold, you think automatically, what's wrong with them? It's not cold. And so it works on basic perceptual things like, is it cold or not? And of course, we use the famous example from the comedian George Carlin of, have you ever noticed that people driving faster than you are maniacs and people driving slower than you are idiots? That's the way it seems, because of course, you look at the world and you drive in accordance with what the conditions seem to afford. You do the best you can to drive the right speed. And then almost by definition, someone going a lot faster than you is going too fast. Someone going slower than you is going too slow. And once you understand that basic point and how it applies everywhere, I think it's a little easier to then take, okay, when I move to politics, maybe I got to listen to what the other side has to say, or at least have to be less inclined to dismiss as bigoted, uninformed positions that differ from my own. And I think if we all do that, you live in a democracy. Democracy requires compromise, and compromise requires an inclination to take the other side needs, wants, beliefs seriously.
If everyone was the same, democracy wouldn't be necessary. So the benefits of that would be not only being more open to the perspectives of others, but the subjective benefits in life could be less frustration, less impatience.
That's a good point.
Yeah, is that what people, if you are aware of naive realism and contextualize yourself within it, is that sort of what would the psychological benefits?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm speculating here, but I think you're much more likely to get in conflict with other people if you're a dyed-in-the-wool naive realist, if you don't appreciate naive realism. We often use this term to describe difficult people of, oh, he or she is high maintenance.
Right.
You're more likely to be considered a high maintenance person if you're a strong, naive realist. Those are speculations, however. What some bit of psychological research that needs to be done, that could, I imagine, be done, is someone develop a naive realism personality inventory. And are the people who score high on naive realism, that is, thinking they're looking at the world rather than their take on the world, would their friends and acquaintances describe them as high maintenance?
Right, it would
gotten in more arguments over a certain period of time, etc.
You could then cross-reference how people self-responded to how other people responded, and then cross-reference and see how big a disparity is there. Was that a sneak peek on something maybe you're working on? Naive realism?
Lee and I have talked about it.
Checklist?
Working on is a bit of a stretch, but Lee and I have talked about it. Yeah.
Thinking about, so you're in the imaginative phase.
Yeah, there you go.
But like you said earlier, that makes it maybe more likely that we'll see that from you and Lee. Can I just ask you about intuition? I don't know where I heard it, but I remember hearing that apparently the intuitions that are most likely to be onto something are the ones that you have no idea where they're coming from. What's a wise way to think about intuitions?
The closest thing to what you said is that there are certain kinds of responses that we have that we don't have verbalizable reasons for. And if someone then asks us for the reasons why we like this more than that, we're going to come up with reasons because we're just good explainers. We're very verbally adroit and cognitively oriented, so we'll come up with reasons why I like this ice cream, this vanilla ice cream, more than that vanilla ice cream. but we're kind of misleading ourselves. It's the real determinants are things that are down deep that we don't have cognitive access to. So when we then verbalize the reasons, we've misled ourselves. And there's research done principally by Tim Wilson showing that if you get people to articulate reasons for things that are more emotional, hard to verbalize, as you let in, intuitive, you're going to make worse decisions, not better decisions. And that's consistent with the idea that you said. Now that's a little bit different, though, than saying, all right, I've got this intuition, I don't know where it comes from at all, that's going to be something I can trust more than I have an intuition that I think she's more trustworthy than he is. And that's partly because, and you can name some reasons, it's not clear that some blend of rational analysis and intuition is going to be worse than intuition. In fact, I doubt that would be the case.
Okay. Last question, quick, and then I'll let you go. Thank you so much for speaking with me late in the evening as well. What are you currently working on, or what are you thinking about most right now? What's occupying your mind?
I'm doing work on conversation right now.
Oh, cool.
It's one of the most social things that people do, might be the most frequent social thing that people do. And when they aren't talking to really close friends and family members, it makes a lot of people really nervous.
Yeah.
Just like public speaking is a phobia for many, many people. I think people would be surprised to find out just how fraught informal cocktail party style conversation is for a lot of people. And we're exploring the degree to which that's true, and that's very easy to demonstrate. It is true. And why it's true. What are some of the psychological processes that make it so difficult? And among the findings are things like, if you ask people after they've had a conversation, how much did you like the conversation? How much do you think your conversation partner liked it? Everyone thinks they've bored their conversation partner when they've enjoyed it pretty much, pretty actively themselves.
Well, that's something to look forward to. Thank you so much, Tom.
You're welcome.
Thank you again to Tom Gilovich for coming on the show, and thank you so much for being here. I really want Psych to be a place where the latest and greatest in the worlds of psychology, social science, cognitive science, and human behavior can come and share their insights, research, and interests with us. So please join me each week here at Psych Psychology University. Thank you so much for being here, and until next time, take care.